Welcome to On the Right Side of History with Kansans for Life. Come with us as we connect the pro-life movement's past to present, uncover hidden or forgotten history, and its connections to the battle still raging today. Now, here's our host, Danielle Underwood.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to On the Right Side of History with Kansans for Life. Today, legal scholar and law professor Elizabeth Kirk joins me from Washington, D.C. Elizabeth Kirk is co-director of the Center for Law and the Human Person at the Columbus School of Law at the Catholic University of America. She writes and speaks on the family in law and policy, and her work has been published in places like Public Discourse, First Things, National Review Online, and many other places. Elizabeth provides strategic guidance and legislative analysis to policy leaders and legislators, and was one of the first people to realize and explain the dangers instituted by the Kansas Supreme Court's 2019 decision in Hodes and Nauser versus Schmidt, which created an almost unlimited right to abortion in our state. While she now lives in the Washington, D.C. area, Elizabeth grew up in the Kansas City area and served for a time as director and chair of Catholic Thought at the Institute for Faith and Culture at the St. Lawrence Catholic Campus Center at the University of Kansas. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
We're so grateful to you for coming on, and I'm excited to be with you, to see you again, and to get to talk with you. You know, there's so much more I could say about your impeccable credentials and the wealth of experience that you bring to this conversation. But I just want to open it up and ask you, what would you want to share with the listeners today about yourself?
Gosh, I think, for me, this issue in Kansas, starting with the Supreme Court's decision in Hodes and, to the present day and the various court cases that are making their way through in the wake of Hodes, for me, this has always been a real combination of my professional interests, of course, in abortion jurisprudence and policy, but also my personal commitments. As you said, I grew up in the Kansas City area. My husband and I and our children lived in Kansas at the time of the Hodes decision. And the pro-life issue has always been close to my heart personally. So, this particular moment in Kansas, for me, has always been really important to stay connected to, despite, as you say, being out here in Washington now.
Well, yeah, thank you so much for being involved and in tune. We call upon you fairly frequently when there's something we need to just get legal guidance on, to know, what do we need to be thinking of or keeping in context as we are looking forward into the future, what we need to be doing here as the pro-life movement in Kansas. And your being able to consult you has been really, really helpful. So I first reached out to you kind of at the end of the year 2023 because I had read a recent piece of your writing in Public Discourse, and I thought you just did an excellent job of breaking down what we're seeing happening in more of from a national scope. I think of things for our work here in Kansas, we're very Kansas focused. And so we pride ourselves on being the experts of, the particulars in Kansas, what's happening here, so that, there is so much to be keeping tabs on right now in any state, but you're looking at it also from a national perspective. And I wonder if you could kind of talk about that national strategy you see playing out on from the pro-abortion activists and what they're rolling out across the country since the overturn of Roe.
Yeah, that's a big question. There's a lot that could be said there. I think, the article that you mentioned that I wrote in Public Discourse was actually initially inspired by a Kansas legal decision, right? So there was a lower court in Kansas that struck down the state's informed consent law, and we can talk about that in a bit. But I was, not surprised by that decision, and it was the occasion for me to take a step back and reflect on: do people realize nationally what they're voting for, right? So at the national level, what I talk about in that article is that pro-choice advocates have been enormously successful at passing these ballot initiatives, enshrining abortion. They're different, from state to state, but the gist of it is that they are, for the most part, enshrining abortion as a constitutional right in their state constitutions. So, Michigan did this, California did this. Let's see, Ohio did this, right? So we've got a number of states that are passing these laws. Vermont did this. And then Kansas and Kentucky, as Kansans well know, both rejected abortion neutrality amendments. So again, win for the abortion advocates, right? But a different kind of amendment. And so that article, I was just trying to understand, why are people passing these laws nationwide? And I use Kansas and what's happening there post Hodes to kind of, summarize for voters, this is what you're actually voting for, right? I can say more, but that's the gist of the article.
I think that's a great start for us. I think we might want to just take a quick pause, and I wonder if you would explain a little bit more what you mean when you say abortion neutrality, because that's I think was a key part of the confusion that I believe was mostly generated by, first of all, the intense messaging from the opposition to the amendment here in Kansas, where, the most visible, obvious sign of that misinformation was all the signs that were out that said, vote no to stop the ban. That's what I saw, was the messaging. And then that was, of course, reiterated over and over and over again by media here in our state. But tell us what you mean when you say abortion neutral.
So I'll preface this by saying that 4 of the amendments that passed last year were not abortion neutral. They were pro-abortion amendments. So in other words, voters in, again, Michigan, Ohio, California, Vermont, they passed amendments that prohibit any legislative restriction or regulation of abortion, right? They enshrine, as a matter of state constitutional law, a broad procreative liberty or right to abortion in their state constitutions. In contrast, all Kansans were trying to do through the Value Them Both Amendment was to pass an amendment that simply would have just made the Constitution neutral, right? It simply would have said that the state constitution does not include a right to abortion, leaving abortion law and policy up to the people to fashion the laws that meet their needs through the legislative process. So the Value Them Both Amendment didn't take a position on abortion. If Kansans want to go in the direction of New York and California and have abortion on demand at taxpayer expense until the moment of birth, they could vote for that. If they wanted to be more restrictive, they could vote for that as well. If they wanted to continue their sort of moderate stance on abortion, of course, nothing in the amendment would have prohibited that either. And so, as you say, what happened, right, in the course of the Value Them Both political discussion is that advocates of Value Them Both were constantly having to explain that they were not trying to ban abortion. That poster or that sign that you mentioned was everywhere in Kansas, stop the ban. Even, I'll mention this, my casebook, I teach family law, came out with a new edition this past year. And in one of the notes following Dobbs, they actually summarized the Kansas Value Them Both amendment process. And they say, Kansans rejected an amendment that would have banned abortion. I immediately wrote to the editors of the volume to say, you didn't get this right. That's not what the amendment sought to do. So that was a kind of disinformation campaign that Value Them Both advocates were trying to battle against from the very beginning. Just the plain language of the statute or the amendment making clear, what it stood for.
Yeah, that's a very helpful breakdown, because I do think it continues to be, and I think it is confusing because of, just the sheer amount of voices that were giving that very bad information, that was truly what was at stake. So, meaning that
I might just add, sorry.
No, I was going to say, that when I say what was at stake, that really goes to the heart of your article, because you mention in there that voters were told that they had this very stark decision to make, beginning really with the amendment campaign here in Kansas. And tell us what they were told that they were actually supposedly deciding between.
Well, I mean, I think they were told that it was a battle between preserving, women's liberty and banning abortion, right? I anecdotally heard people say, gosh, I'm not really comfortable with things like late-term abortion, but I want women who have miscarriages to get medical care, right? So they were being told that not only was the amendment itself, a ban on abortion or a pathway to banning abortion, but that it would prohibit women from getting ordinary medical care for things like miscarriages or ectopic pregnancies, or that it would preclude the legislature from enacting laws that had, exceptions for things like the life of the mother, et cetera. So voters felt like they had this sort of, that they were kind of boxed in, right, to two extreme positions. In Kansas, I think what they didn't fully appreciate, right, is that this amendment did not come out of nowhere. The amendment was against the backdrop of a Supreme Court decision, the Kansas Supreme Court decision in Hodes, which had held that the state constitution does have this fundamental, what they called a natural right to abortion, and that any law relating to abortion would be subject to this test called strict scrutiny, which is just a fancy law term for we will look at it very, very, very closely, and almost every law that we look at will likely be struck down. And so what Kansans didn't realize is that they were voting against the backdrop of a legal situation that was already extreme, right? An extreme embrace of abortion as a fundamental right. So that they just didn't appreciate the true nature of what was at stake.
Yeah. So this playbook then has been rolled out in other places as your various versions of this. So these radical pro-abortion activists are doing similar things in other places around the country. And like you said, they've had enormous success in doing that and waging that kind of disinformation campaign, where we've seen, ballot referendums that pro-lifers are 0-6. This is for their recipe, as sad as it is to say, because it is built on such, just immoral means, I think. But it's working for them. And I think, we need to be aware of that as the tactics that are rolling out, and actually, we have to be able to stand up and continue to set the record straight here in Kansas. And one of the things that you helped explain very early on was the downstream effects of that original Hodes decision, what that would mean if we didn't fix the situation that had been imposed on us by the Kansas Supreme Court. And, with that amendment not passing, we're seeing those effects now. And so I think, why don't we talk about how does that outcome of the amendment vote restrict our options here in Kansas and restrict the options of the pro-life movement, what we can do in terms of law? What can we do? Right.
So in Kansas, because of the Hodes decision and the failure to override that with the value them both amendment, what we have is a legal regime that is as protective of abortion access, right? An expansive, permissive abortion regime. And as I said, that legal test, strict scrutiny, is used by courts. It's been used by courts since Roe to strike down kind of ordinary, not just what some might call extreme abortion bans, but ordinary laws that have the support of most Americans, whether they consider themselves pro-life or pro-choice. So laws like late-term bans, laws like parental involvement, whether consent or notification, laws like modest waiting periods, informed consent laws, that is, laws that require women seeking an abortion to be provided with information about the nature of the procedure, alternatives, risks, that sort of thing, resources should she wish to parent, adoption, information about adoption as an alternative, laws restricting taxpayer funding of abortion. Those are all laws that tend to get majority support of Americans. Most Americans are not comfortable with unrestricted, unregulated abortion. One could also add laws that, regulate the safety and hygiene of abortion clinics. Those kinds of laws are all struck down under strict scrutiny. Mm-hmm. And so that was one of the things we tried to persuade Kansans, that if you don't respond to HODIs with value them both, all these laws will be vulnerable.
Yes, because just to interject, those are all examples of ones that we have here in Kansas, and all of those had bipartisan support. Those were not considered to be, some kind of extreme measure. They were common sense, reasonable protections. A lot of those were protections for the woman involved in the scenario here. So I think, continue. That's really helpful.
Yeah. And so, again, I think, and similarly in the states that have passed these broad constitutional protections for abortion, similarly in their states, right, the laws that they have, Michigan, Ohio, they have modest abortion regulations on the books. Those are also going to be vulnerable. And so one of the things, those of us in the Value Them Both, advocates of Value Them Both tried to point out is that these laws in Kansas that we have on the books are going to be vulnerable. The response was, what are you talking about? We already have those laws on the books. Of course they're not vulnerable. Nobody's saying anything about these. We just don't want you to ban abortion, right? They constantly were putting us on the defensive that we were intending to ban abortion. The media never pushed them on what's the first law you're going to challenge under HODIs. We're not challenging any laws, right?
Right.
So,
and in the meantime, they would use the words abortion is abortion providers are heavily regulated. That was the quotes around that, heavily regulated, and just exactly what you're saying. We knew that all of those laws were in danger, but that was never spoken, and they were never held to account, just like you're saying.
And it being interviewed by the media as I was, about our secret plan to ban abortion, I more than one time asked the reporter, are you going to ask the other side what laws they plan to challenge, right? Pushing the media on making this a kind of fair and honest public discourse about what was at stake. In any case, that there wasn't that kind of fair and honest public discourse. And once Value Them Both failed, what happened? They challenged the Women's Informed Consent Law, the Woman's Right to Know Law, one of the most basic, benign statutes that exists, right? Making sure that a woman seeking abortion has access to is able to make a fully informed, non-coerced decision. Mm-hmm. That's something, regardless of your view on abortion, we should all support. We should all support women being able to make a fully informed, non-coerced decision.
Yes.
And
even some basic
that
protections.
Law got struck down.
Yes. Even, one of the things that really struck me is that, part of that law that they struck down was the woman being given access to information about any kind of medical board actions taken against a provider, an abortion provider. So the doctor who is going to be actually doing the procedure on them, that they are now denied information about any kind of medical board actions taken against that provider. It's very simple things, the 24-hour waiting period, making sure that the woman, after she's received information about, what she's seeking there, which is the abortion procedure, that she's got time to consider that decision and, really think through the ramifications of what that's going to mean. Some very basic protections. And to your point, we really thought that is, when you talk about women's rights, you would think protection of their life, their health, their safety. You would think that would be a top priority. And yet they went and sued that law. It was shocking to us. Not unexpected, but still very difficult to see.
One of the things I found so telling, and I think I mentioned this in the article, is if you read the complaint, the abortion provider's complaint, the original lawsuit against the Women's Right to Know Act, they admit that women seek abortion, right? Often because they have social pressures or economic pressures, right? So it's that they feel that they don't have enough resources to meet the additional demands that would be posed by the child, right? They admit that. And yet they oppose the woman being given information about material resources that would respond to her needs, right? Her material needs, her social needs, her educational needs. They oppose her being told that a father has a legal obligation to support the child. They oppose her being told that there are material and medical resources available to you should you continue your pregnancy and wish to parent. They oppose a woman being told that adoption is an alternative to parenthood, should you wish to explore that. And so they don't want her to have resources that are directly responsive to the reasons they admit are motivating her desire for an abortion. It's difficult to understand.
It is difficult to understand from our perspective, and yet from theirs, if being a profit-driven industry, they sell more abortions by more women feeling desperate and that they don't have access to resources, that they don't have access to help someone to walk alongside them. So it makes sense that they would oppose it, but it still sickens us to think that they would actually fight to keep information from women. So
it makes sense, I think. Sorry, I was just going to say, I think it makes sense, you're right, from an industry perspective, but from the ordinary American who's caught up in this, right? I really believe Dobbs was the opportunity, the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs that returned this to the people, was the opportunity for Americans to talk to one another about this issue. We don't agree about it, right? And this is the occasion for us to look, though, more deeply at many of the things we do agree about, right? We all want to help women, children, families who are struggling. I suspect we actually have more in common with one another than the abortion industry would like us to think, right? And so even though the abortion industry is motivated in this way, ordinary Americans, I think, should kind of stop and think about, is abortion the best we can come up with, right, to respond to women's challenges and real needs? And are there other ways that we can walk with them and accompany them in these kind of difficult moments?
That's a really powerful point. Thank you for bringing that up. You're right. So looking at, we realize that our current laws, our existing laws are under threat and are being sued. We expect more will be sued. But let's talk for a second about what can we do going into the future. How does the outcome of that amendment vote restrict the legislative options available to pro-life Kansans now and going forward? What can we not pursue?
Sure. Well, one consequence of the Supreme Court's decision in Hodes is that any law relating to abortion will be subject to this strict scrutiny test and therefore is vulnerable. So it's just, kind of common sense that would have a chilling effect on the legislature in terms of its willingness to pass laws that are likely to be subject to extensive litigation right off the bat.
That's a great point. So we have to go forward with intelligent legislative proposals that can assist. We can help save lives through working to provide, for example, more resources to pregnancy resource centers that can truly work one-on-one with women to help them have what they need to be able to make life-affirming choices. That might be an example of a way that we could go, working towards positive goals to help provide things to these women who are facing these unexpected pregnancies. Are there any other examples that you would want to throw out of either, things that pro-lifers need to keep in mind are either we need to avoid or we need to pursue? Anything like that you'd want to add?
Yeah, I think, I do think it's a fraught environment. I just want to be honest about that, because the nature of, as you pointed out earlier, the given the interest that the abortion industry has here, it may be more aggressive. But I don't think that should intimidate us, right, from passing laws or from attempting to pass laws that we think respond to real pressing issues. In places like Kansas, unfortunately, right now, it's likely going to be impossible to pass laws that kind of meaningfully restrict abortion itself, right? We'll have enough on our hands in some sense to protect the laws that we have on the books. At the same time, I think there are areas with the HODIs, the strict scrutiny test involves is the state articulating a compelling interest, right? And drafting legislation that responds to that compelling interest. And I do think there are issues regarding abortion that pose those kinds of real compelling concerns. One example that comes to mind is many of your viewers may have seen a video of a Kansas City, Missouri abortion clinic that was willing to and admitting that they regularly, every day was the quote, facilitate the transfer of minor girls across state lines in order to obtain abortions. The abortion worker kind of proudly said, and we never tell the parents, right? So this real concern that young minor girls are being trafficked across state lines without their parents' knowledge or consent to obtain abortions, with no meaningful consequence for the not to mention no meaningful care for the young girl, but also no meaningful consequence for the predator involved. That's a very concerning situation that I would think the Kansas legislature might want to take action and, risk the possibility that a Kansas court might say, gosh, we're sorry, under HODIs, we can't even allow this law to pass. That could be a risk, but I think it's one worth taking on. But as you say, I think importantly, given where we are and given the real hurdles of the misinformation campaigns that we face, I think a chief thing we need to do is really focus on the culture, right? There's no restraint, or there shouldn't be a restraint legally in passing laws that make the economic realities more amenable to women and men welcoming their children, right, into life. And so anything we can do, right, to alleviate the underlying reasons that drive women to think that abortion is their best or only alternative are things I think we really need to focus our attention on. Building that culture of life that ultimately, hopefully, will one day be reflected in law.
Absolutely. And, at Kansans for Life, we've really focused this legislative session. We've just released our agenda, what we'd like to pursue, and it really is a care and compassion driven agenda, because we want the pro-life movement to do what the abortion industry never does, and that is to show care and compassion, true care and compassion for women. And that involves much more than what the abortion industry ever offers. There are far too many women who are told that abortion is their only option, and we want them to know that's not the case. So we're pursuing those types of measures, and we're excited about the potential for making some positive gains that will be life-saving, that will help more women to choose life for their babies. So, why do you think this legal reality is so hard for some good-hearted pro-life people, and especially outside organizations? Why is it so hard for us as everyday Kansans to really wrap our minds around this legal situation? Is it the misinformation that we're constantly subjected to, or is it just that it's very complicated, the whole legal process, the judicial system? What do you think it is that makes it difficult for us to really wrap our minds around it?
I think that answer is pretty difficult. It's difficult to give one answer. I think certainly the value of them both experience led me to believe that it is just very difficult to explain to folks the nature of a state Supreme Court decision and the nature of this particular legal test and how it I mean, you sort of get people's eye, my own family members, their eyes would glaze over when I, try to explain these things. Not that they're difficult really, but it's just, not the sort of thing most people are used to assessing or analyzing or weighing. Honestly, I more and more, I encounter people who really just find it hard to believe that cases of unregulated abortion exist, or that, some women abort healthy infants in the second or third trimesters, right? They just, their understanding of what abortion involves is sort of sanitized, right? And they don't really realize the true nature of the industry. They don't realize that women or girls are pressured, that girls every day, right, are transported across state lines against their parents' knowledge or, consent. So I think that, the more that we can do to kind of inform people, not only about the law and, that sort of thing, but also just about the reality of abortion is important to do, so that when they have the opportunity to weigh in at the ballot box, that vote is more informed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's a big part of our role here in the state, is to continue to, we're really trying to ramp up our education efforts and help people understand these topics much more deeply than we have in the past. I think, before Roe was overturned, we had kind of a singular mission. As a pro-life movement, we saw that as the major hurdle. And now we realize we have to make sure that we're teaching the youth of our country these very important truths that are underpinning this discussion, so that if we don't do that, if we don't help explain the truth of the pro-life position, then, who's going to? We're not leaving that to our public school system. We're not leaving that to the media. We have to do it ourselves. So that's a really important. We want to be the source, the go-to source in Kansas for people to get their information about the pro-life battles that are underway and what we can do about it. So let's talk about that for a second. Then I really, you did a great job of explaining the challenges that the challenging environment we're working within. I always want to make sure when we do these podcasts, I always like to leave, what are some things that everyday Kansans can do what are some ideas for how Kansans can keep fighting for, the protection of life? And obviously Kansans can't get involved necessarily directly with the judicial system, but I think this kind of goes back to what we were just talking about. How do we communicate this to other people around us to help them understand these truths?
Well, there are so many ways in which each of us, might be called to kind of build up this culture of life that we've been talking about. I think, we shouldn't be overly discouraged by the state of the law, as discouraging as it is to many of us, right? Especially those of us whose vocation is law. It shouldn't be discouraged. It doesn't prohibit, anybody from working to help women, women and men, to welcome children, right? So whatever your listeners feel called to do in terms of, being part of a support network or being part of a welcoming environment. I'll just mention here at Catholic University, where I teach, in the wake of the Dobbs decision, the president of the university immediately formed a committee, right? This isn't required by law, but immediately formed a committee to look at our internal HR policies and to say, are we a place as an employer, or are we a place as a place that forms students, that encourages faculty, staff, and students to welcome new life? What can we do to make our community a more welcoming place? And so I think if you run a business, if you have any influence in any community, right, to use that influence to help it be a more welcoming place. Certainly prayer is very important. Certainly, directing your philanthropic efforts, whether it's money or time, to organizations like yours that seek to educate people, to hold the abortion industry's feet to the fire on these issues. One of the things I point out in my article at the end is the incredible increase in the number of abortions in Kansas, which I think is just going to continue to skyrocket. But the majority of those are from out of state, right? Well, in the wake of this video that I mentioned, that's kind of on my head and heart lately, how many of those are young girls, right? Like, is Kansas reporting properly, as they ought to, about minors who are seeking abortions and the reality that they, that they might be the victim of coercion or predators? Holding their feet to the fire, right, on the existing legal obligations that they have. There are just so many different ways in which I think all of us can contribute to making Kansas a place where life is welcomed, if not in law right now, at least in reality.
That's excellent points. And I think, people can get involved in passing these kinds of legislative proposals that we're going forward with that do address some of those things that you just talked about. And I think that's going to be very important for the pro-life movement to stay united behind these sound proposals that can actually make a difference. And you mentioned reporting. That is part of our legislative agenda that we've just recently announced, that, we believe that there are some real improvements that are needed in the statistics that the government provides to, first of all, the legislators, the policymakers, those who need to make decisions based upon good data. We want to make sure that is is provided in a timely manner, because right now that's not been happening, and in a fuller context, so that we do have better data to make decisions based upon going forward. So that's an excellent point. Recently, we've been talking about how people can get involved with Kansans for Life, as we are heavily involved in this legislative session. Just as reminders to everyone who's listening, if you are not receiving our updates, we're going to need you to be involved this session. We're going to need you to be watching for action alerts that we send out for the moment that your action is necessary, when you need to be reaching out to your legislator. And we're going to make it very easy for you to do that. But we'll have just a small number of times that we will definitely be calling upon you all as members of this movement to help move these good, important proposals forward. So that was actually a really helpful comment that you just made, and let me just mention that. We do have, if you're interested in the kinds of proposals that are part of the pro-life legislative agenda this session, you can go to our website at kfl.org and go to our news section, and you'll see those proposals that are going to be listed out there, so you can see what we're doing. So any other thoughts as we're closing out this conversation today that you think are important for Kansans to either remember, know, or do? What do you think?
Honestly, I think we've covered a lot today, and I want to thank your listeners who are engaged and attentive, to these important things. I think the main thing I would want to leave people with is a note of encouragement. That we shouldn't let these kind of setbacks at the ballot, that we've experienced both in Kansas and nationwide, discourage us too much. Of course, they should make us think carefully, right, about being wise and prudent in our strategic thinking. But we shouldn't be too discouraged. As one of my professors in law school, who was a kind of pro-life stalwart, Charlie Rice, always used to say, don't worry, we're on the winning side. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's just, important not to be too discouraged.
I love that. Thanks for that reminder. So, well, on behalf of Kansans for Life, I just want to say thank you, Elizabeth, for joining me today on this podcast. And thanks to all of you who joined us today via YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all the different platforms where this is streaming. If you are an active member of the pro-life movement and you're looking for something tangible you can do today to help, please share this podcast with a friend or a family member, someone you know will be interested, because there was so much great information Elizabeth gave us today, and I think many, many more people need to hear it. So please share it out. And if you would like to stay up to date on this and all pro-life topics, visit kfl.org and sign up to receive our updates. That's kfl.org. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, now called X, Instagram, and TikTok. We're trying to be where all the people are, so you can find us on one of those platforms, at Kansans for Life. And as we say goodbye, never forget, the pro-life movement is on the right side of history. Truth always wins in the end. We hope you'll join us next time. Thank you.